Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Adam Leventhal. So the Michael Carrick era at Manchester United has got off to a flying start, hasn't it? So how has he done it? And what would it take for him to get the job permanently? Well, with me for this one is Adam Crafton out in New York City and Mark Critchley in Manchester. So we're going to be talking about the great form that Manchester United are in fourth after that 1-0 win over Everton, how Michael Carrick's dealing with on and off-pitch matters as well, which includes Sir Jim Ratcliffe, and we'll also be talking about the future. But I wanted to start with Adam Crafton and a little peek behind the curtain of us preparing for podcasts. Adam, what did you post in the pre-show group late last night about how well Manchester United are doing? You can tell everyone. Come on.
It was a table, I think, of the last 10 games?
Yes.
Shows Manchester United the most informed team in the Premier League. 6 wins, 4 draws. I think that must also encompass a couple of Ruben Amorim games.
Even the Wolves games
as well within that. So give Ruben his due as well for his role in that. But clearly it shows what kind of everyone's had the sense of, which is that playing Man United at the moment is probably strangely like the hardest game in the Premier League, and has become a huge shift under Michael Carrick in terms of results. Not necessarily always performances, but I think there is clearly a momentum with them, and it's a pretty amazing transformation if you just compare it to, I think, how the club and the fan base were feeling after the FA Cup defeat against Brighton, where it kind of felt at that point like Man United might not even make Europe, and that they were sort of sliding down the table. So it's a pretty remarkable turnaround.
Yeah, Critch, just give us a little vibe check. You've been around the fans. How are they feeling? Yeah, I mean, we're sort of almost making light of the fact that, yes, they are top of the form table, but it means a lot. 22 points from the last 10 games. Below them are Arsenal and Manchester City, who are considered to be going along like a train of sorts. So tell us, how does it feel right now?
I think it's very positive, honestly. I take Adam's point that the performances perhaps haven't always been there, and maybe the real highs were right at the very start of Michael Carrick taking charge with those wins against City and Arsenal, and there's been a few more concerns along the way once United have played against teams that they're expected to beat, but he's still getting results, and that's key, more so than anything else. I think in this Premier League season where nobody's quite sure whether the standard has been raised or whether it's been lowered, everybody can just beat about anybody else on any given weekend, and it's all very tight. If you can put a string of good results and good performances together, that can catapult you into places that you never really expected to be. I think we saw that earlier this season with Aston Villa, and with that run of 4 wins in a row, not 5, just 4, but then the draw at West Ham and back to winning ways again last night, suddenly you're looking at the table and United are in a far stronger position than, again, as Adam mentioned, I think anybody could have realistically expected, even after that Brighton game, or certainly when Ruben Amorim departed at the turn of the year. There's a real positivity around the way that not only the results, but the way that United are playing. It's seen as though the style, the intentions that they show when they're out on the pitch are more aligned, if you like, with what people like to think of as the traditions of the club, the way that they're supposed to play. Taking risks has been a huge, huge factor. It was something, a bit of a stick that was used to beat Ruben Amorim with during the final days of his reign, that he was being too conservative, that if he was going to change things, it would always be one centre off for another on 60 minutes and nothing much else. Carrick's changed that. He has looked to sought to take risks late on in games. You can think of the Arsenal game where Dorgu came off injured, but he brought on Šeško. It was the sort of thing that you hadn't seen before from United managers, or certainly under Amorim, and they went on to win that game late on. I think he's scored more, substitutes have scored goals under Carrick than they had previously throughout the rest of the season in the last few games. He's affecting things from the bench. He's employed a style of play that United fans resonate with. And I think that's part and parcel of why everyone's feeling so positive at the moment.
Now, Adam, obviously Michael Carrick wasn't in charge of any sort of recruitment decisions, but did it feel symbolic to you last night watching the goal set up by Cunha to Mbeumo to then Šeško, and it almost reflecting the fact that there have been some things that Manchester United have got right? We'll talk about the goalkeeper in a minute with Mark, because he's been writing about him. But that goal in particular, it was a moment where you thought, yeah, we are on the up. This is looking good, and those players are what we needed.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, for most of the season, they've kind of been. Yeah, obviously, Šeško's form's got a lot better over the last few weeks, but Mbeumo and Cunha really, from the first game of the season, have looked like they could cope at Manchester United, and I think most people had that sense when they came of, they were players who had already proven themselves in the Premier League, that had been at kind of mid. Well, I guess Wolves maybe mid to lower last season, to be fair, mid to lower Premier League teams, but they felt like very low risk signings in many ways. Like, if these guys can't crack it, you tried buying players from Holland, you've tried buying players from like sort of cast-offs from Real Madrid or things like that. It was almost like, well, if these guys won't work, then who is ever going to work at Manchester United at this point? So I think it's a much better recruitment model to sort of buy what's already proven in the Premier League rather than trying to sort of adapt people. And they needed goals. Manchester United haven't scored enough goals over the past few seasons. And that's been a major issue. It was a huge issue for the club last season. And this season it's a lot better. Their attacking record is far improved. I still think they can add to it, particularly in kind of wide positions with, now that Manchester United have decided they're a team that plays with wingers again. They probably need to go and sign one or two in the summer, given the system change. But yeah, look, Ineos have had a huge amount of scrutiny and criticism at times, and I think rightly so, over what happened with Dan Ashworth, over keeping Erik ten Hag, over the extent of their belief for a period of time in Ruben Amorim in the face of all kind of evidence of performances and results. But the recruitment has got better, not just this summer just gone, but the summer before. If you look at Matthias de Ligt, Lenny Yoro, not so much on Joshua Zirkzee, but they're getting more right than wrong in the transfer window. And if they can get another couple of windows like the one they had last summer, then they'll have a team.
It was interesting what you said there about, buying players that are ready for the Premier League and not necessarily having to adapt players. But I was reading what Benjamin Šeško said after the game against Everton, and he was very sort of direct in talking about how much help Michael Carrick has given him and his staff as well. And it seems that attention to detail is also part of the package that Michael Carrick brings, especially having been a player that came to Manchester United with big expectation. Yes, he was a different character, very cool, calm and collected. But I suppose that feeds into his offering as a Manchester United manager in particular, Adam.
Yeah, he's got experience. He's been there. He's done it. Similar to Solskjaer before. I think there's a lot of similarities actually between Solskjaer's interim period and what we're now seeing from Carrick's interim period, which is, taking over from a Portuguese coach who had kind of exploded by the end and caused ructions with those, potentially with those above him. Not a great mood among the fan base or the playing staff, a kind of a sense of lost traditions of style. So Solskjaer came in, like Carrick came in, sort of went back to what is considered a recognisable Manchester United style, simplified it. Players would speak of those little touches, of little bits of advice on the training ground, supportive. And I think that's, both encouraging, given, the results, but possibly also like a note of caution as well, because, interim period doesn't necessarily translate into kind of being ready for success. But no, clearly, I mean, Carrick's just come in and simplified everything. From press conferences where there's now very few headlines compared to Amorim, where there was 1,000 headlines, to the style of play on the pitch, where I think every player, there isn't a player who is playing worse now than they were 7 weeks ago. So I think that is of huge credit to the coaching staff. There isn't one Manchester United player who is playing regularly that you could say has got worse. Everyone is better. And that's both damning of Amorim, but also of huge praise to Carrick.
Critchley, I did say I was going to ask you about the goalkeeper, and I will do that in a moment's time. But just picking up on what Adam said there in terms of the press conferences, obviously Amorim press conferences were very interesting and incendiary at times. Honesty and, humility and there was kindness in there as well. I get it. But what's the feeling now amongst the press pack walking into a Michael Carrick press conference? Is it, okay, it's going to be quite straight bat and yeah, we don't mind it? Or do you think, this is a bit dull?
I think the feeling among the press pack is, wouldn't it be great if Michael Carrick could manage the team, but Ruben Amorim could still do the press conferences? I think that would be the ideal scenario. Look, I think there's an element of that, what you say. He absolutely does play things with a straight bat. The straightest bat that I've ever really known any manager to play it. And it's not even like he doesn't engage with the question, though. I think that's important to say. He does, he doesn't give short shrift to things. He will take a question on board and will speak, at a considerable length about what you're asking him about. And what he says often, I think, it's like perfectly reasonable. It's like the most reasonable answer you could possibly give, and something that I think if we were speaking on a podcast, we would say ourselves or agree on. And so it's not even like there's an issue from that perspective. It's not his job to create headlines. His job is to create a stable environment where it's conducive to winning football matches. And I think that's exactly what he's done in all of his press dealings and all of his press conferences so far. You're just not getting the same, because the answers are so reasonable, you're not getting the same incendiary, controversial talking points that Amorim would routinely come out with. And from this purely selfish journalistic perspective, it makes it a bit harder to necessarily sell the lines that you're getting out of this stuff and use them in pieces and use them in copy. But I think from the club's perspective, there'll be people in a very tired and fatigued media department at Manchester United who are quite happy that there's a manager who is answering things with a straight bat and who isn't giving us reams and reams of things to write about afterwards. The one thing I perhaps would say is that, the results have been really good so far, and that's great. When results don't go your way, that is sometimes when you need to be able to tell a slightly more engaging story as a manager to be able to defend your ideas and what you're doing. And that is something that Michael Carrick hasn't been tested on yet, I suppose, simply because he is getting the results on the pitch, and ultimately that's what matters.
Just a word on how he does deal with things in press conferences as well. When I was reading the transcript of what he said after the game, and now I can talk about the goalkeeper, he was even sensible without trying to, hype up Senna Lammens and, comparing him with Edwin van der Sar and things like that. He's even sensible with that, never too high, never too low. And that's a good way of being, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And that is the sort of tenor that
even though Lammens is clearly brilliant, by the way.
Yeah, no, like last night, for Lammens to have that performance last night, for Edwin van der Sar to be appearing as a pundit on the main television channel in the UK, reviewing it, absolutely set up like for comparisons to be made and similarities to be drawn, and those parallels to be spoken about afterwards. So it was inevitable that they would be. I think Carrick told the right line in terms of saying, look, I can see why you're asking the question, and I can see those similarities myself, without trying to heap too much pressure onto Senna Lammens. But to be honest, he was always just focusing the answer back on Senna Lammens himself and his performance, and it was a great performance. I mean, I think we were talking about the signings there. There's an argument that this is the first time in a long time that all of United's major signings in one summer have about 6, 7, 8 months into the season, we can say that they're all having good seasons. And I think they're all making a difference. But I think the argument is that Lammens is probably making the biggest difference of any of them. If you compare him to his immediate predecessors in his position, you imagine some of the other goalkeepers who played for United in recent years being in the position that he was in last night, being under that intense pressure, those balls dropping underneath his crossbar, but right on top of him over and over again. The stramash of plays in the middle of the box, something that we've seen a lot more often this season compared to previous years, but something that a lot of goalkeepers in the Premier League are struggling with. I can remember Altay Bayindir, United's second choice goalkeeper, when he was starting games at the beginning of the season, struggling with it on a weekly basis, essentially. Lammens has never really looked like that. He's, at a time when a lot of goalkeepers are really being tested by the approaches that teams are taking and opponents are taking on set pieces, he's always brought this air of calm, of composure, of just being able to deal with it, of command and control, essentially. It's not like he's perfect, though. There was only a few weeks ago in the Arsenal game, Arsenal's equaliser for 2-2 it comes from one of these situations, and maybe there's questions to ask about how Lammens deals with that. But this is a very testing environment for goalkeepers in the Premier League at the moment. And the difference that I see with Lammens compared to those goalkeepers who were playing for United previously is that if he does have an error, if he does make a mistake, you expect him to get over it. You don't think that there's going to be a pattern of them following one after another again and again afterwards. That's something that is a real key difference. And I think that's why last night in that game, United, with a different goalkeeper in the net, they maybe dropped 2 points, maybe 3 points, but they didn't. They took all three, and you can attribute a lot of that down to Senna Lammens' performance.
And Adam, I just wanted to get your take on this because, people that aren't obsessed with Manchester United will be listening to this. But one thing that they will know, especially if they're from England and they're English football fans, they'll know that Kobbie Mainoo is a really good footballer. And they will have been confused watching Manchester United with him not in the side and Ruben Amorim just clearly not fancying him. But now he's back, he's playing well, and he's having a sort of a metronomic presence, just like Michael Carrick. It makes sense, doesn't it? I just wanted to sort of get your take on overall what he has been able to do with just putting players in the right shaped holes, basically.
Yeah. I mean, Mainoo, it doesn't matter if you're a Man United fan or you're watching football for the first time. I don't think anyone could make sense of what happened there with Ruben Amorim and Kobbie Mainoo. It was crazy. And it was also crazy that Manchester United, it didn't get to... If Ruben Amorim would have stayed, Manchester United would have taken his side on this, and they would have lost one of the best young footballers they've ever produced. So, for all the credit, that we're giving Ineos for the summer dealings, that could have been one of the biggest mistakes that Manchester United have ever made. I don't think I'm sort of exaggerating there, because it's just so clear that, they've got a 70, 80 million pound midfielder and they weren't using him. And I do get the argument that in Amorim's system, the amount of ground that needed to be covered and the gaps between defence and attack made it difficult for Mainoo. I'm not sure he's quite got the engine for that. But I don't know I actually don't really know any central midfielders who have the engine for that for that specific system Amorim played in the Premier League. It's different, with the speed and the physicality of the Premier League and the demands of it. And the truth is that Manchester United were prepared to sell Mainoo last summer. What is interesting is that the offers didn't quite come. That whatever Amorim was seeing, there was some scepticism being shared in other parts of the Premier League. It wasn't like Chelsea came with a £60 million offer, which Manchester United would have taken, or Newcastle came with, 50 million. I think they would have even have taken 45, 50 million last summer for him. And Manchester United should be grateful, that he didn't. But, just on Amorim's kind of judgment, it wasn't just Mainoo. Even on Lammens, was that sort of strange period where Lammens first came, where Lammens couldn't get in the team, and for the first few games, because he's sort of stuck with Bayern. Now, you could say that was just kind of getting him ready in training for the Premier League. You could say that's good management. But I think there was also a bit of a spillover there from Amorim probably wanting a different goalkeeper in the summer. We know he wanted a more experienced goalkeeper. Emi Martinez was clearly the one that I think his preference was. And I think that was a case of actually a sporting director model, a better recruitment model, putting their foot down and saying, actually, no, Ruben, we're going to do what's right for Manchester United in the long term here, not spend probably far higher wages on a World Cup winner who's, who's at getting towards the other end of his career. And I think they've been proved right on that. So, often we often take the side of managers, don't we, in those battles with sporting directors, and I think that's an example of it working better. But Mainoo would have been an example of it working the other way.
So we've been speaking of how well Michael Carrick has done in reducing the noise around Manchester United, but he could do nothing about the Manchester United co-owner Sir Jim Ratcliffe speaking on Sky News not that long ago and claiming that the UK had been colonised by immigrants. And then he later apologised for his choice of language. It was pretty much a half apology. United, meanwhile, released a statement expressing their commitment to being inclusive and welcoming to people from all backgrounds. So we're a few days on now from this, and it's been something that we've wanted to get into on the podcast. Just give us a take, Critch, on how you feel that situation was dealt with, both publicly and also behind the scenes.
Well, I think first of all, from a purely United perspective, I think I find it hard not to have an element of sympathy with the club for being embroiled in something that was not of their own making. If we accept that Manchester United is not defined by as an entity that is owned by Sir Jim Ratcliffe. Sir Jim Ratcliffe is an extremely successful businessman, an entrepreneur in his own right, and he will often hold court on subjects that aren't related to football. And I think he'd like to see himself as somebody who is able to do that and has the right to do that as a hugely successful business person. But I think what it would be useful for him to realise is that people care a lot more about football than they care about hydrocarbons. And so when he speaks on any subject in any capacity, if what he says is interesting, newsworthy, or particularly if it's as divisive and as controversial as what he said in that interview with Sky News, then that is going to be framed as the views of the Manchester United owner or part owner, co-owner. And that is something that when he says things is like what he said, it puts the club in an awkward spot publicly, and it causes a lot of, puts them in an awkward spot publicly. It's extraordinary that they ended up releasing a statement which was essentially refuting the sentiments of their owner, not directly as such, but everybody knows the context in which that statement was made. And so publicly, it puts them in an extremely awkward spot. I think internally, it caused a lot of disappointment. People that I was speaking to within the club, around the club, felt extremely let down by Ratcliffe's remarks. Myself and Adam wrote a piece in the days that followed, like sort of looking at, but we're sort of placing the comments within their UK political context, but also within the context of what was happening at United. And I think we mentioned in there, reported in there, how staff were raising concerns the day after Ratcliffe's comments, before the club statement was released, how the inbox was receiving a lot of complaints from individual fans, but then also even the fans forum group, which is essentially the representative body that liaises with the club on important fan matters and meets regularly with the club. We were doing pieces a couple of weeks ago about how United are struggling at the minute on the commercial side of the business to attract and retain sponsors and partners at the same level that they were previously, given the results, given the off-field controversies that there's been. And in that piece, actually, one part of that piece was reflecting on how, because of the changes that Ratcliffe has essentially led and the INEOS hierarchy have led over the past couple of years in terms of job cuts and redundancies, there's actually fewer people around now in the commercial department to help keep sponsors happy when, for example, the co-owner of the football club goes out and says what he says about immigration. These are actual effects. And so this, I don't think that, look, it's fallen out of the news cycle now. I'm not saying that people have forgotten about it. It was actually one of the more intense United stories that I can remember covering, because despite all the things that happen at this club on a seemingly weekly basis, it's very rare that you have the Prime Minister discussing it, that you have huge political figures, that it being the lead item on Newsnight or whatever. It's rare that happens, and it did that week. And although it's sort of fallen out of the news cycle now, I think in the respect of the commercial impact on the business, how it's made staff within the club feel, I think it's only going to be a story and a sentiment that runs and runs and runs in that respect, even though it's not necessarily generating headlines at the moment anymore.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, Adam? Because obviously Critch has said there, it's fallen down the news cycle, but is this a case of mud sticking? And this will be something that a lot of United fans and potential partners will always revert back to. It will always be in their mind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that commercial partners will necessarily associate, Manchester United with these comments long term. I do think for Ratcliffe, it's going to be one of the first things that people think about. It's the old man. It's the old man in the corner of the room who has a lot of opinions, and some people will like those opinions, and some people very much don't like those opinions. Like when some staff that I spoke to, said they were, as Critch said they were incredibly disappointed by it, that some complaints were made. There would also, as is always the case in these situations, you only hear from staff who are disappointed. You don't hear from the staff who are agreeing, because that's just the nature of the world, that people who might agree or who might not be bothered have less to say. So that should always be kind of reflected as well in these moments. I mean, the obviously disappointing thing purely from a Manchester United perspective is, for once, for the first time in a few years, like, the vibes were good. The vibes were good at Manchester United. There weren't really, there wasn't, there was a long period without games. There was nothing to write about. Journalists were crying.
It was the guy with the hair. That was the only thing anybody was talking about.
Right.
The dude with the hair, yeah.
The dude with the hair was the only story around. That's how calm it had become in the space of 5 weeks. And then, to have a story like that where, and it really was a story of its moment, because it just, every political figure in the UK attached themselves to that story in some way. And if you remember at the start of that week, like, Keir Starmer seems to be facing a coup from within his own party. That was the story of the week, and it was overtaken. That story was genuinely overtaken because Manchester United are a bigger global deal than whether Wes Streeting, the health secretary, might try and become the Prime Minister. And it was almost as though, I'm sure Keir Starmer genuinely disagreed with Jim Ratcliffe's comments, but I think there was also probably a little bit of a calculation of, well, who does the public love talking about more than difficulties in the Labour Party? It's difficulties at Manchester United. And that's why it became a story of greater significance beyond the obvious concern that many people had as well. But I think from a Manchester United perspective, to see, like, far right agitators, people like Tommy Robinson kind of attaching themselves to the comments of a Manchester United owner. I mean, it's deeply embarrassing. The comments were obviously offensive to very many people. The apology, I thought, was pretty pathetic, to be honest. It was basically like, "I'm right, lads, but sorry if anyone took offence." And but equally at the same time, it was the only apology he could really give, because if they'd have come out with like a statement saying Jim, retracts everything he said, no one would believe it, because everyone had seen the video and everyone had seen him. That chance that the Sky News reporter Ed Conway actually gave him, where he actually goes back to him and says, colonised. And then Ratcliffe comes back and kind of explains, yes, colonised for X, Y, Z reasons. And the difficulty for United as well is, even when he's comparing about how to fix the country, he uses the example of how he, in his mind, has helped to fix Manchester United. So you can't make the argument that these comments can't be linked to Manchester United, because Ratcliffe himself uses Manchester United as a comparison. I mean, whole different story about whether he's fixed Manchester United or not. So yeah, that's kind of scattered thoughts of kind of how that week played out.
So Michael Carrick remains in situ until the end of the season at Manchester United. But considering what we've been talking about with Sir Jim Ratcliffe and potentially a disconnect between him and the Manchester United fans, and people questioning his credibility in terms of involvement in footballing decisions. Let's not forget there was the sort of silence and then reactionary retention of Erik ten Hag, and then backing Ruben Amorim in October, saying that he's got 3 years to demonstrate that he's a great coach, and then he got sacked in January. Mark, where did Manchester United hope the decision, or Manchester United fans hope the decision-making will be focused when it comes to who's going to be the next boss? Do they hope that Sir Jim Ratcliffe keeps his oar out of all of this? And is that in any way, shape or form possible?
I think it's very rare for football owners to be universally popular among the fan base. There are exceptions to that, but it's rare. I remember, and Andy Mitten brings this up on Talk of the Devils quite a lot, but I was there myself. There was a game, I think it was against Leicester City. It might have been shortly after Ten Hag had been dismissed last season, before Amorim came in, so during the Ruud van Nistelrooy interregnum period, where Ratcliffe came down onto the pitch at Old Trafford to present Bruno Fernandes with a shirt in like in a plaque, frame shirt, to like commemorate his 250th game, and there was applause and cheering for him while he stood there on the pitch. It was not surreal, I would say, but it captured the moment. It was that there was still very much a honeymoon period. I think even though you mentioned the Ten Hag decision, the will they, won't they, and then keeping him and then sacking him, despite that, there was still, I think fans were still willing to give Ineos and Ratcliffe, as a sort of figurehead for Ineos, a lot of leeway on the direction that they were taking the club in. I don't think he'd get the same reception now if he was out on the pitch at Old Trafford giving Bruno a plaque for his 350th appearance or whatever. It's different now, and I feel that it isn't just within the context of those comments the other week, which I think we should also say were divisive, in the sense that a lot of people disagreed with them, a lot of people found them offensive, some people agreed with them as well, and so I don't think we can only say that those comments were, the reason for discontent with Ratcliffe within the fan base. There's the wider things for that as well. If you think about, we did the piece on Amorim's dismissal at the turn of the year, there was a lot of detail in that about how Ratcliffe was somebody who was pushing for a shift to a back four formation, who was having a level of influence over proceedings within the club. And a lot of the feedback that we had to that article was, why is Jim being allowed this level of influence? Why is he having so much of a say over what's going on? So I think there is a degree, and a large degree, of scepticism within the fan base over Ratcliffe's role. If you look at how it will work, look at the Carrick appointment. That was a process that was led by Jason Wilcox. It had Omar Barada feeding into it. They were sat in on the interviews together. It was their recommendation that went to the board to sign off to appoint Michael Carrick as head coach, interim head coach, whatever we want to call it, until the end of the season. That's how the structure at United is set up. That's how this process that will take. That's how the process will take place, I expect, for a permanent manager as well. But I wouldn't underplay Ratcliffe's influence in things at the same time. I think handling his input into the club is part of both Wilcox and Barada's roles within the club. And he was, the process for appointing Amorim, that was heavily influenced by Omar Barada, but there was still also a one-on-one interview with Jim Ratcliffe and Amorim as part of that process. Ratcliffe has admitted in other unguarded media moments over the past year that he has an influence on transfer policy, even that, yes, Jason and Omar and others decide, but I have a little bit of decision and a little bit of sway in that too. So he is not a neutral actor within this. He's not rubber stamping things. He is still somebody who has a great sway of influence, as you'd expect when you pay, what was it, £1.6 billion for 29 point whatever percent of a club.
Maybe he should stick to transfers then. They've done quite well at that.
He's done okay with that.
Yeah.
But Adam, it's obviously going to be my way or the highway with Sir Jim Ratcliffe, love him or hate him. But in terms of making the right decision on whether Michael Carrick deserves to get the job, obviously there's a fair bit of road between now and the end of the season, and whether Manchester United are going to qualify for the Champions League. But what you've seen so far, do you think that Michael Carrick has a genuine chance of getting the job if those sort of targets are met? So Champions League football, continuing to sort of bed in the new signings and then perform well. Do you think he deserves to get it?
I don't think he deserves to get it based on 1 month's work or 1.5 months' work.
But if he gets into the Champions League, does he deserve it?
Even getting into the Champions League, the hesitation I might have is, and this is by no means Carrick's fault, is the second half of this season it is so different to what Manchester United's usual workload will be over the course of a full season, where you would normally be in 4 competitions, be aiming to get at least to quarterfinals. Champions League will add, 8 games minimum as well. That in some ways, I don't think that helps Carrick, and it's not his fault at all. I think if he was to get into the Champions League, he deserves to be part of the conversation, and he deserves to be part of the process. Whether that means interviews and whatever. The kind of frustrating thing is, if they're going to give Carrick the job, they actually may as well give it him as soon as possible, because you want to start your planning for next season, you want to get on with your recruitment, you want to align on a playing style, all of that sort of thing. And, the longer Manchester United leave the new manager, the harder the transfer window becomes. And the last thing Manchester United need is to go back to one of those transfer windows where they're doing things in August again, and it's all a bit chaotic. So there's merits on both sides, and I'm not really answering it directly.
But Adam, what you've said there is really important, because obviously you've also got a World Cup slap bang in the middle of the summer as well. So it makes it even more important to make your decision and to show faith. If you really believe in Michael Carrick, do it now. Or if you think that someone else come the summer is going to be better than him, almost, you don't necessarily have to make it be known, but at least ensure that you are doing your squad planning now, because you need to.
No, I think you're right. In some ways, I'd be surprised if there's a coach they take from the World Cup at this point, just because of, as you say, the logistical difficulties of that. I mean, there's not many left now, actually, to be fair, that I think they would take, given Ancelotti's extending and Tuchel says he's extending, as well. There's Nagelsmann, that's it, really, from a World Cup perspective. I don't think Manchester United would go for Pochettino. I feel like his stock maybe isn't what it was a few years ago. Maybe I'm wrong. So then you get into like the pool of, people who are available around Europe, and it's not that many people who scream out to you as like obviously better than what Michael Carrick's been doing over the past 5 or 6 weeks. I do think Iraola at Bournemouth, there's going to be a lot of interest in him in the summer. you've also got to bear in mind that there's other clubs who are going to be looking for coaches. Tottenham, obviously, Liverpool, possibly. Who knows how that season's going to end? Chelsea, apparently a long-term project with Liam Rossini, but let's see. And Manchester City, Real Madrid. There's potentially sort of first mover advantage to this. But what we know is that probably Tottenham aside, there's not going to be people lining up to take Michael Carrick, you wouldn't think. Manchester United and Michael Carrick is quite a unique situation. So they can afford to sort of lead him along a little bit, I think, and basically let it get to April perhaps and say, look, if this is still the way we're playing by the middle of April, I do think it's hard not to give him the job at that point. And I don't think that's like, people said, oh, then you're going down the Solskjaer path again. Well, actually, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer didn't do a bad job at Manchester United based on what came before and what came after, over the past 10 years or so. If Michael Carrick was to do a job where Manchester United finished third a couple of times and second, that's okay. It's not where the fans maybe want to be, but it's not terrible. It's not where they've been the last few years or so. So there are merits for it.
Brilliant. Mark, thank you so much for your insight. Same to you, Adam, as well, out in New York. Wrap up warm out there as it gets a little bit warmer over here in the UK. I do hope you've enjoyed listening, and we'll be back with you on the Athletic FC podcast tomorrow.
For more from the Athletic FC podcast, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. We've got top journalists like David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the entire season. Make sure you don't miss an episode of the Athletic FC. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts from.